Hello again. Pastor Pat from Old Stone Church. We're continuing our online Bible study. Today we're going to look at the resurrection, evidence supporting the literal reality of it, and a little bit about what does it mean for us. So here we are again, Pastor Pat and Phil Medeiros, exploring the doctrines of the Christian faith. Now, we started out looking at some of the basic doctrines about God and about people and concluded that human beings do have a dilemma. We are fallen and imperfect. God is holy and perfect, and nothing imperfect, no imperfect flesh can stand in the presence of a holy God. We looked at the cross, the meaning of the cross, and likened it to the Old Testament sacrificial system and found that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. He paid the price for the sins of the whole world. Today we're going to look at the resurrection and discuss what it means and what it means for us. The resurrection is, on the one hand, the capstone of Christian doctrine. It kind of rounds everything off and puts a final punctuation mark. It makes it all complete. But at the same time, it's probably the most controversial. Many people will admit that Jesus lived and died. They will agree that he was crucified. But as far as being raised from the dead, many people think that's a stretch. And there are a lot of very imaginative theories that try to work their way around that. They try to explain it away, some way to keep it rational, but still hold on to some kind of meaning. I want to look at the resurrection in terms of some of the theories that try to explain it away. Some people say blatantly it just didn't happen. It's a fabrication. Some people say, well, it's a metaphor or it's a myth. Some people say that he didn't actually die, or they claim there was some kind of a substitution that happened somewhere around the crucifixion. But these really don't have any positive evidence, and if you look at them a little bit closely, they really don't stand up to scrutiny.
I suppose, too, if you believe in ghosts, you could say that he was a ghost. He wasn't...
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. And he addressed that in, I believe it was John, where he said, give me some fish, because ghosts can't eat. So, it's interesting. That's probably one of the first mentions of ghosts anywhere, at least the first mention of ghosts in the Bible.
Did it actually say ghosts?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Well, I mean, in some translations, it might use other words in other translations. Yeah. But I think in
spirit, or I guess not spirit, because that's kind of got a couple of different meanings, but yeah.
True. It depends on what era you're translating it to.
True.
So first, looking at the theory that it just didn't happen. And this is going to sound familiar, but the same logic applies to this. The Christian message, the message that Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead, was proclaimed shortly after the event. At Pentecost, the apostles started preaching the gospel. They preached it to the crowd that was gathered there. That was 50 days after the resurrection. So the story was being spread pretty early after the actual event. So there would be people who had witnessed it, people who were there at different locations where the appearances of Jesus supposedly would have happened, or they did happen, and they could sort of verify that. The events, the actual events and the proclamation is really very close to the actual event of the resurrection, and many people would have been able to witness and hear the story, and they could have verified it. A lot of people were still alive who had witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, so they could go and ask people. They could go and ask different people. There is no evidence of anyone contradicting or offering any evidence contrary to the resurrection. So given the fact that there were many people around, no contradictions, able to verify, that leans heavily in favor of the resurrection being real, being actual. Now, on top of that, there were times where there were multiple witnesses. 1 Corinthians 15:6 mentions 500 people at one time saw the resurrected Jesus Christ. That's a lot of people. And again, it says that most of these people are still alive. Some have fallen asleep, but most of them are still alive, so you can go and talk to them. Some people claim that that was a mass hallucination, but mass hallucinations, first being very rare, for people to have the same hallucination at the same time is incredibly unlikely to the point of non-existent. It just doesn't happen. There's no evidence for it. And of course, on top of all of that, believers, for centuries after the event, believers were willing to die for the message of Jesus Christ raised from the dead. That this is a powerful message that motivated people, that it wasn't stopped by governments or persecution. And if it indeed did not happen, such an idea doesn't have the power to last for centuries and to endure persecution. So to think, again, that it didn't happen, there's just too much evidence supporting it, too much that could have been verified at the time that the Gospels and the epistles were written, could have been verified, and no one is challenging the fact. We will get to the account in Matthew 28, a story that was circulated, but if you look at that story, it doesn't really hold water either. If you consider that the resurrection is simply it's a metaphor for something, or it's a myth, again, it takes centuries for a myth to develop. It doesn't develop in 2 months or less. And the events of the resurrection are presented as literal, real facts. They mention people's names, they mention locations, they mention time. It's very, very literal and exact. On top of that, it includes some details that in a myth or a fabricated story probably would not have been included within that culture. For instance, and I should probably apologize this ahead of time, ladies, but this is just a cultural detail. At the time, women were not considered reliable witnesses. The last people you want to have as witnesses to the resurrection is women if you want a really believable story. If you're just making a story to be believed, you have men there. But if it's an actual story, well, the fact is the women were there first. Also, the disciples were fearful, they were hiding, they were skeptical, they couldn't believe, they didn't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, even though he told them at least 3 times that that would happen, and even though he was able to raise others from the dead. The disciples still didn't believe that he was raised from the dead. Now, in a metaphor or a mythical story, the main characters tend to be heroic and brave. They're not scared, hiding in a corner behind locked doors. So again, the story of Jesus and his resurrection doesn't have any similarities to any myths or metaphors or made-up stories at the time. A very popular theory for many people is to say that he didn't actually die. That yes, he was crucified, but the Romans mistakenly took him off the cross a little bit too soon. He was still alive. He was put in the tomb. And 3 days later, he revived and was able to come out of the tomb.
Without bread or water or anything.
Right, without bread or water. Somebody said that if that's what happened, then somebody should bottle whatever is in that tomb. It would be a huge health curative, But on top of that, if you look at the evidence, there's no way that Jesus could have survived that. Jesus was scourged with a cat of 9 tails. That's a stick that has leather straps. And since this was a scourging that happened after the sentence of crucifixion, this would be an especially brutal scourging. There would be pieces of metal or bones or glass at the end of the leather strips, so that when the soldiers whipped it, it would actually dig in and tear off pieces of skin, flesh, muscle. It wasn't unusual for bones and even organs to be exposed during this process. One thing I always point out, for those of you who saw The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, the scene where he is scourged, they really played down the gore. As gory as it was, that was nothing compared to the real thing. Romans were severe, and they really worked hard to make their point. So many people who were scourged and had a death sentence didn't survive the scourging. Also remember that Jesus had his hair of his beard and on his head ripped out by the Roman guards. He was in pretty sad shape by the time he got to the cross. Now, Jesus, again, was crucified, and there's not a lot of details in the Gospels, but history is filled with details about crucifixions. What happened is that a nail was driven through the forearm. A lot of times we talk about the nail being through the palm, but that wouldn't be strong enough to hold the body. And in Jewish tradition, Jewish belief, the hand goes up to here. So a nail was driven through for the forearm into the cross. Another nail was driven through the feet, and that's what held the person up to the cross. They supported themselves by shifting weight from hands to feet. The death came slowly. That was the reason that the Romans used it. It was certainly a public example. Jesus was a political prisoner, political victim, if you will. And they wanted to make an example. And they chose a method of death that was very painful and very slow. It sounds pretty brutal, but again, they were making their point.
So were there others at the time that were saying that they were similar to Jesus as far as the level of, I am the one to follow? Just because they persecuted him so drastically just to make the point, that so these other people don't, why go so drastically?
Right. Good question. Good question. The first part of your question, were there other messiahs or other claimants to be the Messiah? Yes. Yes, there were. Not exactly at the same time of Jesus.
Yep.
But Acts 5 talks about the Sanhedrin and Gamaliel's speech, and he says, remember this guy rose up, remember that guy rose up. And there were others who rose up after Jesus died. So there were people who were claiming to be a Messiah, but they had more the political agenda of Israel's ascension. So they were planning a literal, actual government overthrow. Romans didn't cater to that.
Yeah,
they
obviously.
Yeah, really. One very important aspect to the Romans was government. In fact, government was nearly a religion. You did worship the emperor as a god. So in essence, the state was the religion, and they defended it vehemently. Right. So yes, political prisoners got really rough treatment. Now, something else to bring out, crucifixion was not just a Roman convention. Civilizations used it before, as early as the Babylonians and the Assyrians. It was used after. And many people were crucified. It lasted for years. Not once, at least not in the searches I've been able to accomplish, not once did anyone come off the cross alive. With one exception, but this one was an intentional one. The character, the historian Josephus, I mentioned a few weeks ago, was walking by a town and he saw 29 people hanging on crosses. He recognized 3 of them. He appealed to the Roman authorities that they be taken down and put in his care. So they were intentionally taken down from their crosses and put into his care. 2 of them still died. One person, in all of history we have, one person survived crucifixion, and that's only because there was an intervention.
And not to get too far off topic, but crucifixion, at least from what I've read was more of a strapping to the cross versus a nailing to the cross, typically. Correct?
There may have been some straps. There may have been some other support.
Right.
Because part of the impact of crucifixion is if you leave your arms out,
Yeah.
your chest swells and you slowly suffocate. So yeah, there was a strapping, but at the same time, they wanted to make sure there was pain, so a lot of the weight was held on the nails.
It was still also nailed.
Still also nailed, yes. And they have archaeological evidence. They've dug up graves of people who show evidence of being crucified.
And their bones are destroyed or damaged or chipped right where the nail would be.
That's right. That's right. Pushed apart.
See, I assumed that Jesus was unique in that way. Everyone else was more of just a strapping, and like you said, the weight of being up there would make you suffocate or suffer a much longer death versus nails going through your arteries and through your bones and whatever. That would be a quicker, still not quick, but quicker death. So I always thought it was, you're up there for days until you
Well, you
finally
could
die.
be anyway.
Yeah.
You could be anyway. The two thieves on the cross,
Yep.
they were still, kind of kicking and railing. Well, not kicking because their feet were nailed.
Yep.
But they were still railing, and they had a good bit of pep left. They would have lasted probably for a couple days.
You also mentioned that this was a practice that happened for years before. Wasn't there someone who did some sort of premonition about, or a prophet about Jesus dying, but he said he was going to be on a tree because they didn't really know what crucifixion was at the time?
Yes.
So that would be before all of those crucifixions, right?
Yes.
Any
Yes.
idea what type of years that was? Does it mention that?
I'm thinking it's in Isaiah 52, 53, and that would have been about 700 years before the crucifixion.
Okay, so it was still a pretty long time.
Pretty long time.
Yep.
Yes. And the cross is made out of wood.
Right. Which was the argument of tree versus cross, which makes sense because if you don't know anything about a crucifixion, you just think, oh, look, he's up on wood.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, it was prophesized.
Okay. I knew it was prophesized.
Okay.
I heard that a couple times that it was prophesized.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking more of the timeline for his prophecy, and you said that crucifixions had happened for quite a while before, so
Okay.
the comparison of those two times,
Yes. Yes.
So it took 700 years. It was 700 years in between that or so, and it was, there's plenty of time to develop this form of torture.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. You'd also mentioned something else. You thought that the crucifixion of Jesus with the nails was a unique experience.
As far as the nails go, yeah.
Yeah. I used to think that. And the way the story is presented, you don't really get a good sense of the historicity of crucifixion.
Yep.
But when you consider that Jesus is taking the place of humans for punishment, he's going to suffer a form of punishment common to people. So being crucified along with others throughout history is a pretty common form of punishment, and it's
Okay.
part of his identification with humanity.
Okay.
Okay, so going on, talking about people that think he didn't actually die, we do have the scourging, we have the crucifixion, and I want to stress, nobody came off the cross alive. It just didn't happen. The Romans were pretty good. They may not have had advanced medical technology, but they could tell if somebody was dead, which brings us to the next point. Jesus' side was pierced with a spear, and blood and water flowed out. They were separate. And that is a clinical sign of death. When the heart stops beating, the blood settles, any water, any fluids gather on top. So if you pierce one's side, and it doesn't have to be into the heart necessarily, but if you pierce one's side, blood and water will flow out, confirming death. Also, the fact that a spear was stuck into his side and possibly pierced his heart, that alone would have been fatal. So there are at least three things in place that verify or lend strong evidence to Jesus not surviving the crucifixion. It just would not have happened.